So as you can see, this section is called carbohydrates. That's because it will be the first organic compound that we are going to discuss. There are 4 organic compounds in living cells: carbohydrates, lipids, proteins, and nucleic acids right here. We have dedicated one section to each of them because they're each unique and different, and we're going to look at them more in depth. What is an organic compound anyway, and what are we talking about when we say organic compounds? Organic compounds essentially are compounds made with carbon and hydrogen atoms, usually oxygen as well. There can be other atoms present, but the fundamental structure is made of carbon and hydrogen. Here is an example of a carbon skeleton. It's the backbone of the carbon chain backbone here. Other atoms can attach to this, not just hydrogen, but here we have our carbon skeleton of carbon bonded to carbon, bonded to carbon. These lines in the middle represent that bond between each of those atoms. Here, the carbons are also bonded to hydrogens. These capital H's, remember, are the element hydrogen. So we have our carbon skeleton made of a long chain of carbons bonded together, and those carbons also being bonded to hydrogens. So let's look at the very first of our organic compounds, carbohydrates. All known living cells contain carbohydrates. I'm sure you've heard of carbohydrates. The most simple carbohydrate is a very simple sugar called a monosaccharide. Saccharide is a word that means sugar, and mono means one. So it's one simple sugar. It's usually 3 to 7 carbon atoms long. Its carbon skeleton is that long. Examples of a monosaccharide would be glucose and fructose. And you've probably heard these words before. This is what glucose looks like chemically, and this is what fructose looks like. Those are all of the atoms that make up each of those compounds. You can see we have our carbon backbone here, the carbon skeleton, and we have hydrogens bonded to it. We also have some oxygens in here. Here's another oxygen, and they're bonded to that skeleton in different ways. Sugars can be written in 2 ways, and you will probably see this when you look at chemical structures of these compounds. Here's a glucose in its straight chain form. We were just looking at that on the previous page. This is glucose in ring form. So this glucose molecule can basically bend around and form a ring, a cyclic or circular ring that has 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 carbons in the ring and another carbon on the end. It's all the same carbon molecules or carbon atoms, but in a ring form. Another way that sometimes we write carbon skeletons, or really any molecules that contain carbon here, we have this intersecting point right there is where a carbon atom exists. And we don't write it. Sometimes molecules get so large, and to sit and write little C's in for all of the carbon atoms that exist in that molecule is very labor intensive. So a shorter way of doing it is simply to write this bond. This would be between an oxygen and a carbon, which is right there at that junction of those lines that represent bonds. Here is another representation where a carbon atom exists. Carbon atom exists here and here and here as well. They are just not written in as a capital C. So now that we know about monosaccharides, our very, very simple sugars, we're going to look at something a little bit more complicated. It's called a disaccharide. Remember, saccharides are sugars. Di means 2. So 2 simple sugars bonded together. 2 monosaccharides bonded together. An example, maltose. Maltose is a sugar that is made of 2 glucose molecules bonded together. Other examples of disaccharides would be lactose and sucrose. Here is an example of sucrose. Here's the actual molecule of sucrose. It would be a glucose molecule and a fructose molecule bonded together. Now, I don't know if you've noticed something else interesting about sugars, but sugars generally end in the letters OSE. When you see words that end in OSE, they're usually sugars. All right, now let's go to a little bit more complex carbohydrate, polysaccharides. Polysaccharides, of course, here let's look at the word again. Saccharides means sugar. Poly now means many, all right? It's going to be more than one. In this case, it's a lot. They are very complex carbohydrates. They can be thousands of monosaccharide units long. Examples, we have starch, cellulose, and glycogen. Those are all examples of polysaccharides that are very, very, very complex. Starch is a polysaccharide that is in plants. It's used as energy storage in plants. Cellulose is a polysaccharide that we find functioning as a structural molecule in the rigid walls surrounding plant cells. Wood and cotton fibers have a lot of cellulose, so they give structure and support to the cells. Glycogen. Glycogen is a polysaccharide that is found in animals, in animal muscles. It's often called animal starch, and these are where we find some of these carbohydrates. So advanced, how do polysaccharides differ from each other? You could look a little bit more into their specific structure. How about, could you create a model of a simple sugar in ring form or in straight chain form? You feel free to use the chemistry model sets in the classroom and construct a model of some of these some more simple things. Of course, it would be a little bit too difficult to probably create a model for glycogen or cellulose, but you can certainly look at some of the monosaccharides. So hope you enjoyed this little bit of information on carbohydrates, and I look forward to seeing you in class.